And there's a vulnerability. And the vulnerability is the fact that the NATO alliance, which, if it means anything, means the willingness of the member states, including the United States, to defend each other in the event of armed aggression or coercion, has expanded into Eastern Europe, including into the Baltics. And the fundamental fact is that the Russians enjoy a very distinct military advantage in the locality. As I think Sam rightly argues, this is not really just a hybrid war problem. From our perspective, what the problem is actually an integrated kind of strategy, which is to say, little green men sure could be part of it, but likely more would be part of it, for instance, in a Baltic contingency or in other parts of NATO Eastern Europe, would be designed to create or foment or exploit propitious conditions that the Russians could, if they deemed it worthwhile, be the bases for escalation to the use of their conventional forces. And we make the point that Russian conventional forces receive a lot of disdain these days, but actually that's unjustified. Over the last decade or so, they've substantially modernized with a great deal of success, although limited and imperfect, their conventional forces in a way that they have a core of a highly trained, well-equipped, professionalized force, a rapid response force, some call it, numbering almost 100,000 potentially, very sophisticated anti-Axis area denial forces, strike forces. Don't take it from us, take it from General Breedlove, General Gorenz, the commander of U.S. Air Forces Europe, naval forces that are capable of strike throughout the Euro-Atlantic region, and so on and so forth. Now, these may not seem that scary when you stack it up as IISS does in the military balance against the total capability of the United States and its NATO allies. But the problem is that in the conventional conflict in particular is often about geography. And the Russians are talking about something that is literally on their doorstep. Between they and the Baltics is no major national boundary, or Eastern Europe, no major topographical boundary. And so they can bring forces to bear very quickly and potentially create a fait accompli, or a situation which NATO kind of has to respond to. And they can do very, very quickly. Putin said, I think to the Ukrainian president about a year ago, that they could be in the Baltic capitals in about 2 days. He may not be entirely wrong. And just by way of comparison, it would take NATO forces on the order of weeks and potentially more to bring forward the kinds of forces that would be required to dislodge them. Now, the problem in particular is that the dislodgement of such forces is much, much more difficult than defending against them. And they're only at this point very token forces in Eastern Europe and the Baltics. And the problem with this is if the dislodgement campaign, if we assume that NATO and the United States went in to try to push the Russians back out, even if we assume the will, doing so might seem inordinately escalatory and might involve a degree of resolve and will and cohesion in the NATO alliance that could be too demanding. And if the Russians could seek to manipulate this caution and this indecisiveness, ultimately by looking to what many have called their escalate to de-escalate strategy. Basically the potential to use targeted strategic conventional strikes and ultimately limited nuclear strikes to basically try to spook the Western alliance into backing down. This is an extreme scenario in some respects, but it's not implausible, and we know the Russians have been talking about it for some time. So this is the possibility. Sometimes I think to myself, am I exaggerating it? But I look at the basic kind of structural aspects, the correlation of forces, the existence of political disagreements, the existence of irredentism and dissatisfaction on the part of Moscow, and I say this is a real problem that needs to be addressed. What are the kind of basic outlines of what a NATO response and a U.S. response would look like? Well, today, the implicit approach is essentially a kind of a tripwire. There's an assumption that the Russians are basically unlikely to do this because it would be so dramatic, it would be such a risky endeavor. And that's true, but at the same time, it's actually the very fact that NATO credibility and U.S. credibility is so tight, and that also makes it potentially attractive, because it is a way to test the credibility of the U.S. commitment to NATO. I mean, that the president went to Tallinn and said the things that he did last year. So today we kind of rely on, well, there's token forces in the Baltics, and if the Russians killed an American, it would be curtains, and they would be pushed back. But if the Russian strategy that I described is a real one, which we think it is, then that would be a lot tougher than people currently understand, and could be a lot more demanding than people understand. So our view is the alternative strategy is a better one. It's not to try to say necessarily we could clearly defeat the Russians, say, automatically or quickly in a Baltic contingency, although that might be your ideal. Rather, the idea is to build a much more robust and sophisticated and effective conventional deterrent, including forward, so that any Russian aggression would have to be much larger, more brazen, more costly, more risky, more clear, and for that reason would be more deterring on the part of to Moscow, but also would make any NATO and Western response that much clearer and more justified, which is crucial in thinking about the interaction of escalation and how a limited war, which both sides would want to keep it, would eventually terminate. And of course, at the end of this would also be NATO nuclear forces and US nuclear forces that would be able to take away the Russian option to sensibly see that they could escalate to de-escalate. The point of these deployments, again, is not to threaten Russia, but is to take away what is, I think, a real potential strategy and a real vulnerability in the interest of stability. Jonathan may not agree with me, but I actually think this should be coupled with an arms control outreach to the Russians, because I don't think we necessarily need to do this. And if the Russians are willing to talk Turkey, great. Let's figure out a way how we can avoid to do this in a way that's satisfactory for both of us. But as the Secretary General wrote recently, the Russians are not allowing NATO and Western observers to participate in exercises and tests and so forth. And the whole kind of CFE mantra, or CFE architecture, which we built in the aftermath of the Cold War, has kind of corroded as Sam worked on this. Not your fault, but I think the kind of strategy that we're talking about is not at all incommensurate with a dual track and a way of trying to de-escalate. But to me, and I think to Jonathan, the best way to have a lasting stability is not to present a vulnerability, and the way to have that is to have a strong deterrent.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank ISS for the honor of being able to talk today. This is my first time talking at a think tank, and this is a fantastic opportunity, so thank you. So I'm going to overlap very slightly on what Bridge talked about. I'm going to give a bit of a background on conventional deterrence theory, because I don't really think it's very well understood commonly. Like nuclear it's big cousin, big brother, whatever. It's really widely appreciated, I think. I don't think the nuances of conventional deterrence aren't nearly as so. So nuclear deterrence is based around the prospect of punishment, really harsh punishment. Conventional deterrence doesn't really work that way. A adversary might look at the prospects of getting whacked a couple times with a couple long-range cruise missiles, the prospect of sanctions if you want to delve outside of the military realm, and figure that the temporal nature of this punishment or just the scale of the punishment is not enough to deter them from doing the thing that they might want to do. The prospect of denial is far more powerful. The idea that if red goes into an ally of blue or blue's territory, the prospect of receiving untold, strict, high costs, risks, uncertainties, and these are far more compelling in the calculus. So the theory goes from the late Cold War, and there's been extensive scholarship done during the Cold War. I think it's been largely forgotten today. So we want to present the adversary with an assured prospect of exceptionally high cost, risks, and uncertainties if they pursue aggression, and ideally with the prospect of failure. And that requires credible means. What do I mean in terms of that? I mean capabilities, I mean quantities, posture, and position. All these things have to be in balance in order for a conventional deterrent to be credible. You can't have one and skimp on the rest. And that's what Bridget and I have done in our article. We've tried to configure a conventional deterrent strategy that is balanced based around the political realities today, as well as what we feel would actually be credible from the Russian point of view. You need forces that are in position and postured to react immediately or nearly immediately to a thrust, that be survivable or resilient against the adversary's first strike. They have to be sized to delay, disrupt, or deny that thrust, at least until heavier reinforcements can arrive. And those heavy reinforcements must be able to arrive. Now, part of the Russian capabilities aren't just designed around potentially rolling into a Baltic state or one of the Nordic states' frontiers. They're also designed to inflict deep strike, to interdict the reinforcements coming forward. Because if you can roll over whatever forces are forward and NATO can't reinforce, well then it's game over. So we need to have not just the material solutions, the forces, the technologies, but also the force conditioning, the human wetware, if you want to use that term. Forces that are conditioned to fight in this environment. And they must be able to hold their own, at minimum. Ideally, defeat, reverse, roll back. But is the prospect of denying the adversary the ability to succeed that is the most compelling. We can't assume that we're going to have indications and warning of imminent aggression. I mean, look at the track record. I think we're over 4 in the last couple of years. Georgia, then Crimea, then the Russian incursion in July, August of 14 in Donbass, and then Syria. We're not doing that well in the indications and warning department. Or if we are, then the political leadership isn't acting upon it in a determined fashion. And that's something we have to be attuned to, that you need to have forces that give political leadership the options of pursuing restraint or potentially scaling up in a much slower, more measured manner. So we need to have forces that are designed to fight or at least contest at each portion of the conventional spectrum. Not just the high end. And a lot of what we've written about is about the high end, but also at the lower ends, the blended area. Some use the term hybrid warfare. The Russians use, I think, nonlinear. But the idea that you might use irregular forces or regular means or proxies to accomplish limited means. Conventional deterrence has something to say there too. So in our view, the NATO Very Rapid Task VJTF, I forget what the exact acronym stands for, it doesn't meet those criteria. Because while it is sized considerably large, it's not clear that it's going to be positioned in a location where it can intervene fast enough, deploy into area fast enough to blunt a Russian thrust. And there's only one of them. So if the Russians were potentially to do something in one section of the European frontier as a deceptive move, a distraction, when the actual thrust comes in somewhere else, the VJTF could be out of position. You need to have presence forward in each area that means something to you. And so the forces can't be just tripwires either. You have to keep in mind that during the Cold War, the forces aligned across, the NATO forces on the inter-German border, they were more than just tripwires. Especially in the late Cold War, they were designed to delay, disrupt, deny. They were not designed to, once the first couple of battalions got bloodied, then that triggers the U.S. Theater nuclear response. No, they were designed to provide leadership options and to bloody the Russians if the Russians came across. And that's along the lines of what we're arguing in our article. A symbolic tripwire is not enough. So what do we need to implement this type of deterrent? They must be balanced with the aim, as Bridge said, of not excessively provoking Russian paranoia, while also not exposing our forces to the risk of first strike vulnerability. At the low end, we encourage that NATO frontier states, especially the Baltics, should invest in developing sizable national law enforcement paramilitary forces that can quickly mobilize to parry irregular or proxy operations the Russians might conduct. NATO could provide these forces with special operations and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance support as well. But to prevent the Russians from then doing exactly what they did in Donbass last year, when the Ukrainian counter-terrorist operation was very successful, the Russians then intervened, at first using long-range artillery and then across the border more directly. You need to have conventional forces that are latently backing your paramilitary law enforcement forces. We think that at the low end, especially the ones that should be perhaps deployed in the Baltics, should be forces that can impose costs while not excessively being provocative. And we think light mechanized forces using vehicles similar to the U.S. Stryker that could quickly deploy infantry armed with advanced anti-armor munitions and provide cueing to other forces, and then hit and run raids, quickly redeploy, because it's clear these forces would be able to stand up against a heavy Russian armor assault, but they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to impose cost, and we think that's the type of force that could do that. But they themselves would then need to be backed latently by heavier NATO forces. That's your full-on armor. We think that those forces could be put perhaps in Poland, and the Poles seem very attuned to something like this. And the question would be what the force configuration should be. How many in the Baltics, how many in Poland? Rand's done some interesting analysis on this in the last year or so, using a certain number of brigades. I think we're open to what the force structure should be, but I think it's sizable. Battalion, brigade, there's a debate that can be had there. These forces need to have long-range artillery support, both mobile alongside themselves as well as from further afield, because Russian long-range artillery is going to be a considerable threat to any of our forces operating in this area. We need to be able to deal with the Russian long-range surface-to-air missile threat, S-300, S-400 series, that can basically create a gigantic bubble around this theater that would prevent, or at least pressure, NATO air forces providing support, reinforcement, you name it, in that area of operations. We need to be focusing on electronic warfare capabilities that can protect our forces from Russian long-range strike. And we need to invest in longer-range strike forces. And the Army has the ATACMS missile. They haven't been producing them in, I think, a decade or so. They're looking at what the next generation of that should be. The Russians have Iskander-K. We need something that can balance that and can be used as a countervailing threat. You need aircraft in theater to support these forces. It's not clear that we have the right proportions of aircraft or that they're properly postured in Europe for this. I'm in favor, I think Bridge as well is in favor of putting at least an F-22 squadron in Europe for that purpose, because you're going to need a low observable aircraft to survive inside the Russian air defense envelope in the forward theater. You look at how we might use long-range bombers from the Air Force or elsewhere and forward position them in Europe to provide anything ranging from support of forward forces to deep strike. We need to be looking at ad hoc air bases, understanding that our forward air bases are going to be ranged by Russian long-range artillery and missiles. And so we need to look at concepts such as what the Air Force has done with Rapid Raptor in the Pacific, to be able to quickly move and redeploy detachments from F-22 squadrons or perhaps other aircraft to make it very difficult for the Russians to target those forces on the ground. Mobile anti-air weapons to protect our ground forces. Again, electronic warfare. Theater-wide air surveillance systems to provide warning. The Russians have similar systems, we don't. They have a better view of what's going on over Europe's airspace than we do. In the naval sphere, we talked about, Bridge alluded to the threat to the lines of communication, both in theater but also across the Atlantic. You've heard this from Admiral Ferguson at U.S. Naval Forces Europe, and I believe the Norwegian foreign minister also alluded to the area denial, anti-access threat is reemerging for being able to get into Europe. And so we need to look at how we might use our aircraft carriers, whether U.S. or the Royal Navy, looking at how we might use the existing forces in naval forces in Europe, rebuilding the old Surface Naval Forces, Europe Surface Naval Forces Mediterranean for these purposes, giving them high-end capabilities again. Anti-submarine aircraft in Iceland, we haven't done that in 20 years. And we think about the logistics side as well. And you're fine enough to have all these forces there, but if you can't feed them, equip them, give them munitions, keep the lines of communications flowing, then you're for naught. And so we need to look at what we did back in the late Cold War for Forager. Not exactly the pound for pound correct model to use today, but something like that. We need to look at what kind of concepts we can use to get forces from the continent of the United States flowed into Europe and then to the front, as well as for the forces that are in Europe themselves, and keep them fed and supplied. We need to be looking at decentralized command and control, because there's one area where the Russians are very capable in. We've seen this in Ukraine. It's being able to disrupt communications, being able to exploit them. We've heard anecdotes. In fact, I think Deputy Secretary of Defense Work just the other day in a speech at CNAS was talking about how a Ukrainian unit might come up on the radio net, and within a few minutes they were being ranged by artillery. Radiating not smartly is death in today's electronic warfare world.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Yeah. Thanks, Bridge, for leading us off so capably.
We ate up into his, sorry.
Well, he's going to get his share, but he won't go as long. We do want to have some audience interaction. So, Sam.
Thanks, Mark. I'm not going to summarize my article, which deals as much with Russian writing on this concept of hybrid or limited war as it does about NATO or Western writing on the subject, but rather, because I think it'll be more fun, respond to some of the things that have been that are in Bridge and Jonathan's piece. But also, I want to start by taking a step back. Why are we having this conversation today? Or rather, why weren't we having this conversation 5 years ago, and what has changed since then? I mean, Russian capabilities have certainly improved, and my co-panelists certainly note that, but the sub-regional conventional imbalance that they focus in on has been a fact of life since the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004. So the problem has existed for a long time. So why are we talking about this today? The answer, I think, is pretty obvious. Russia's actions in and around Ukraine, starting in 2014, have dramatically changed threat perceptions in NATO. And that's, of course, completely understandable. But we need to drill down, I think, more on the implications of the Ukraine crisis for a potential Russia-NATO conflict. So why do Russia's actions in and around Ukraine imply heightened threats to NATO? More importantly, do we have good evidence based on the Ukraine crisis that Russia is prepared to risk a conflict with NATO? So I begin my analysis with some what I consider first-order questions. What is Russian strategy? What are Russian objectives? How does the Russian strategic community see the world? Have the answers to any of these questions changed dramatically in the past few years? And so while I quite enjoyed rereading and reading the first time around my co-panelists' piece, I think their paper centers around a very specific scenario that doesn't address precisely those, what I would consider first-order questions. So we've heard it alluded to, but I think it's worth honing in on what the scenario that they focus in on precisely is. So, and I quote, Moscow has a plausible strategy to create or exploit ambiguous local circumstances in Eastern NATO, use such conditions, and its highly capable but limited conventional military forces to create lodgements within the alliance which the alliance would find it bloody and dangerous to displace, and then seek to either coerce or entice the alliance to settle on terms advantageous to Moscow, and then using or threatening to use its A2AD capabilities and so on. And they write that the Kremlin has the capabilities and it seems reasonable to assume a strategy for a limited kind of victory, assuming in a limited kind of war. So in my mind, this scenario raises two questions. First, is a hybrid/limited war plausible between Russia and NATO on NATO territory? I use hybrid, and they do not, which I applaud them for, but I think the meaning in this context is relatively similar. And is such a limited war against NATO consistent with what we know about about Russian strategic thought? And my answer to both is no. So I think there's been a focus on the purported success of Russia's hybrid war in Ukraine, and that has led to a view that there is such a doctrine that could be applied against a NATO member state. And this, I think, lies at the basis of that scenario that Bridge and Jonathan write about. But the first point to make here is that assuming that this could be applied to NATO does ignore some key aspects of the Ukraine operation and draws the wrong conclusions from it. First, the nature of Russia's military objective was very specific to the circumstances and quite limited. It was about preventing the reestablishment of governance after the revolution in February 2014. Governance had collapsed without Russia doing anything, or at least not on the military level, and this was about preserving chaos, not creating it. So second, of course, the setting of eastern Ukraine made the objective far easier to pursue. In fact, I argue in the piece that this is the most permissive environment outside of Russia's borders for this kind of operation. And I got in the piece, you can read it, there are a lot of details about why, in terms of the nature of the theater in Donbass, and also the nature of sentiments among the local population. And here I sort of have to take issue with one claim in the piece that Bridge and Jonathan wrote about the nature of insurgency as a general matter. They wrote that if no indigenous population is willing to serve the Kremlin's ends, Russia's state security organs are primed to be able to fabricate one. So I don't believe that you can create an insurgency out of bad intentions and thin air. You need a conducive environment for those insurgencies to come into being and survive. Because humans, and even pro-Russian ones, are sentient beings. They're not robots programmed by televisions. So in my view, then, not only in the environment-specific factors are key, but also the reality that Jonathan mentioned, which is that the hybrid element of that operation actually failed. It had to become a very non-limited, very traditional military intervention in the summer of 2014 in order for it to be sustained, even in this incredibly permissive environment. So that's why, in my view, that Russia's Ukraine operation does not amount to a template for potential conflict with NATO. Ultimately, there's no such thing as a war that could be limited to this ambiguous conventional realm. But the authors, I think, make this scenario the basis of their analysis because they assume that Russia would choose hybrid tactics in order to sow discord within NATO, using ambiguity to create divisions about what was happening and how to respond, and thus break the alliance politically. And I think that scenario reflects well-founded doubts about alliance cohesion and unity, but I don't think it reflects the reality of Russian strategy. As far as I could tell, in the open source literature in Russian, there is no evidence of such considerations. And moreover, what we know about the way the Russian military thinks suggests that an attempted limited war with NATO would not make strategic sense from Moscow's perspective. For the Russian military, the most significant threat in the Baltic region is the potential deployment of U.S. forces and high-end capabilities, the kind of stuff that Bridge and Jonathan are talking about, particularly given the vulnerability of the Kaliningrad exclave. So a Russian hybrid operation or limited war operation would give ample time for the U.S. to do just that. And of course, Russian military planners are going to assume not that NATO will be plagued by indecision and navel gazing, but that the U.S. would react decisively, because they have to. That's what military planners do. And so an ambiguous operation would give the U.S. the time to do that, precisely that. So the scenario that's always talked about Narva, the Russian-speaking town in Estonia, so by the time the little green men maybe establish their outpost there, the 101st Division could be in Tallinn. Is the scenario I sort of envisioned in the piece. And I think the other key point in this context is that Russia has other options. It does not need to pursue a limited and ambiguous operation, and it can take steps militarily using the imbalance that Bridge and Jonathan talk about to eliminate the possibility of a potential U.S. deployment. So why it would start and in this way, I personally don't see a good reason for that. So Mark mentioned the other key factor in this context, which is about intentions. Is Russia, if not hell-bent, then at least more bent on conflict with NATO today, or does it seek stability in relations with the alliance? I mean, I think definitive answers about intentions are notoriously hard to give, and I wouldn't hesitate definitive ones, but I would make 2 points. We can make judgments about intentions based as much or more on what Russia has not done rather than what it has done. So the authors write that the Kremlin will only find opportunities to exploit NATO if the alliance presents attractive vulnerabilities. Well, the authors present some pretty attractive vulnerabilities that have yet to be exploited. And the second point is that to pursue alternatives to their recommendations, you don't have to believe that Russia isn't interested, in theory, in hegemony in its near abroad or in undermining NATO. I mean, these statements such as Putin's alleged to Poroshenko, and you can cite any number of other ones, are highly incendiary and maximalist, of course. But I think what is relevant for Western policy, U.S. policy, is not what Moscow wants in an ideal scenario, what Putin could sort of dream up if tomorrow he woke up and could control everything. It's what Moscow can feasibly achieve in reality. So even if Putin dreams of recreating the Soviet Union and getting rid of NATO, that doesn't mean that A, he will risk actions to achieve those outcomes, or B, that he will try, if he tries, that he will succeed. So what would be my alternative course of action? I think, in my view, that the course of action outlined by my esteemed colleagues here would create the worst of both worlds. The Baltics would remain indefensible, and we will be in a full-blown crisis with Russia. I don't accept the premise that just because we say they're defensive, Russia will accept it as such. That's, Bob Jervis has amply demonstrated that the historical record suggests precisely the opposite, that steps that are one state intends to be clearly defensive can be easily interpreted as aggression by another. In other words, if I'm sitting in Moscow, how is it possible not to read this plan as a prelude to war? And think about it like this. If Russia were to station those same capabilities in Mexico, how would the U.S. military respond? Based on my analysis of Russian strategy, a Russian attack on Eastern allies is only plausible in the context of a major Russia-NATO crisis that has escalated dramatically. It would be a major attack in the context of what used to be called general war, I think, and it cannot by definition, be deterred in that context. So step one in light of that, is mitigating the current Russia-NATO crisis and dampening down tensions between Russia and the alliance. Of course, you cannot completely rule out any contingency. So if we are worried about a limited war in the Baltic region, I agree with the authors when they advocated deterrence by denial strategy. But I think you can get that by, A, regular rotational deployments of U.S. and other Western European troops to establish the tripwire that Bridge referenced, and also B, and perhaps most importantly, full integration of the Russian-speaking communities in Estonia and Latvia into their broader society and the end to their economic marginalization. I mean, this addresses the theoretical weakness in the alliance that could be exploited, and frankly, their social and economic integration into the broader societies would be much more effective than deploying capable paramilitaries after the fact, but developing those capabilities would seem to be important in contingency contexts anyway. But I think the broader question here is sub-regional conventional inferiority so apocalyptic as the authors portray it? They write that we've reached a point at which allowing the vulnerability of Eastern allies to persist is destabilizing. Well, looking back on the history of the Cold War, I think not about the inner German border, but West Berlin in this context, where we had a completely indefensible West Berlin, completely surrounded not only by a massive East German army, but of course the group of Soviet forces Germany, far more indefensible than the Baltic states. And yet, the Soviets never invaded. And the reason they didn't is, of course, that extended deterrence works. And I see little reason today to suggest why that wouldn't be the case.
Good. That's a good place to stop. And he didn't say apocalyptic, but
It's a little license. Okay.
Okay, now if this were a real debate, we'd have a rebuttal immediately, but you'll hold off on that until we have some interactions with the audience. If this is all on the record, it's being recorded and streamed, please state your name when the microphone comes to you and make a concise question. So can we have a microphone gentleman here in the purple tie, the fifth row back? And do we have? Yes, okay. In the festive Christmas purple tie, gentlemen. right there.
Michael Kimmich, U.S. Department of State. I want to ask about one other factor that might figure in Russian calculations with this. And let's imagine that their intention was to show that NATO is a paper tiger and that, through some kind of invasion, hybrid war, they succeed in that. Wouldn't the EU and the U.S. essentially cut Russia off economically for the foreseeable future? I mean, way beyond SWIFT code and things that were discussed with Mariupol and Ukraine. And wouldn't this, in a sense, be a price that was too great to pay, just in a kind of practical, material sense?
Let's take a couple of questions, if we may. Gentleman right in back there, Tuyen, right there.
My name is Marius Laurinaitis. I work for SIPA here in Washington.
Is the microphone on? I couldn't hear that. Okay.
Marius Laurinaitis, I work for SIPA here in Washington, D.C. I have several observations.
Not several. Make just a concise, please.
One is, we in the Baltics, I'm from Lithuania myself, we in the Baltics had absolutely the same threat perception back in 2004, which was mentioned. So at that time, we were called paranoid people about Moscow. And I still remember these times. And when we speak about Russia, that we should judge about Russia by the things it haven't done, I really remember all these times of back from 2004, because all the time before Georgian war, before Ukrainian war, when we after the Georgian war, before Ukrainian war, when we were saying the same thing, that Russia is preparing for something, we were still called paranoid people. So, to my mind, we should really judge Russia on the grounds it did something, not on the ground it haven't done. Thank you.
Okay, and then we'll take one more. The far back, the last row, gentleman who raised right on the left. Yeah, sorry, still on the left. I didn't see anybody here on the right. Was there somebody on the right? I meant the one on the left who raised his hand. He didn't? No? Right. You in the last row? No, you didn't raise your hand? No. Oh. Sorry. Okay, right here in the. Okay, sorry. Yeah. Going once, twice.
Second option, Philippe Masson, Simaclati Associates. One quick question. We spoke a lot about the East and the border regions. My question really is, how solid is NATO? And when we're talking about Article 5, especially Western Europe, how realistic is it today to think that we have real cohesion?
Okay, good. And if I could just add one chairman's addendum to this last question about NATO cohesion, NATO intentions. Bridge, you said at one point that NATO might be cautious about escalating in response to a Russian incursion. Having been in a NATO country the last 10 years, it seems to me any Russian aggression against a NATO country demands an immediate response. How that could be perceived as escalating, unless they were to go to nuclear, that would be escalating. But I wonder what you meant by escalating in ways that NATO might be cautious about.
Sure.
So why don't you take that question, and then maybe the economic question and the.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thanks for Sam's remarks. We'll try to shadow box indirectly. It's very, very thoughtful presentation. On the economic sanctions, I think the way I think about this is any kind of conflict where the Russians would think that they could do something like this would be essentially a limited war, right? I mean, both sides are nuclear armed powers with survivable nuclear forces, so they don't want the war to become total. Now, you never know; it could always become total. But in essence, any conflict or any kind of manipulation of escalation approaching conflict is going to involve trying to find out where a conflict or struggle terminates far short of that. And economic sanctions are actually part of this. I mean, people actually, when they talk about the SWIFT issues, they actually talk about Russian counter-escalation in the sense that the Russians may actually regard some forms of economic sanctions as being equivalent to the use of force, right? I mean, in principle, some kinds of economic sanctions are worse than the use of force, right? So, and this connects, I think, with what Mark is saying, that basically, and I differ on a range of points with Sam, but one is that this is such an abstruse or kind of Baroque kind of scenario. I mean, this is actually the kind of plausible scenario that I could see the Russians actually pulling off, and it actually could make quite a bit of sense. And the way I'm thinking about this is the way that this would work is if the Russians could either create, exploit, foment, whatever, a situation in which they could actually push the onus of escalation onto the West, onto NATO, in a way that would not only be difficult to generate political support for in the United States and would make the United States and other countries more susceptible to intimidation, for instance, if our GPSs were interrupted or something, but would also make the cohesion of the NATO alliance more difficult to create and sustain, right? So suspending SWIFT is a big deal, right? So you're going to have sign-on. Now, if it seems like the justice of your cause is less clear and less strong, then it's going to be much harder to get that political support, right? I mean, in 1973, a lot of the European allies refused overflight to U.S. forces supporting Israel. What happens if the Germans don't allow overflight or transit of U.S. forces? That's huge. And that's going to be, I mean, the kind of trite example I use, I was thinking about it over lunch, is, I mean, this actually may have happened, but what if it was a patriot who fired the shot heard around the world at Lexington Green? That's where I see Little Green Men. I agree with Sam that hybrid war is not some kind of special cure-all kind of thing. But basically, I mean, my short response to what Sam is saying is the Baltics and Eastern Europe are one part of the world where the United States extends its security guarantee to an ally and where it is conventionally inferior in a plausible kind of scenario to a nuclear-armed adversary. You know, the Berlin A is not a good model. We don't want to repeat that. And by the way, there was a brigade in Berlin. You know, that was a lot of people they were going to have to chew through. And I think what John said is absolutely right, is the idea is to make it so that the Russians don't see opportunity. And yeah, we should try to de-escalate the situation with the Russians if we can, while not compromising on our important interests. But that's how, we, in a limited conflict and in the shadow boxing and deterrent posture before that, we're going to have to think about how escalation is going to make us look, what kind of response it's legitimate, et cetera, et cetera.
Sam, I think the second question about Russian actual actions is something we have to attend to. Maybe you could address that as well as any of the other points that have come up.
There's no question that Russia's actions are, egregious violations of international law. You could use any adjectives you like in the last few years. That's really not what we're talking about here. I think what is interesting in this context is that you could, using a shorthand, Russia essentially invaded a country to keep it out of NATO. So, which suggests that it understands the difference between NATO and non-NATO Europe. I would keep that in mind in looking at judging intentions based on actions. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I didn't answer your question. Would you like me to?
Yeah,
briefly?
go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, I didn't get to it. And the point of what I meant by that is, if the Russians are able to create a defensive lodgment, basically if you can create a redoubt, the steps you have to take to dislodge that are themselves more escalatory. So for instance, if you are seeking to defend, you can have, Sam makes an absolutely valid point, which is defensive and offensive weapons are often in the eye of the beholder. But you may have to do less, whereas if you're trying to dislodge forces, you may have to strike deeper, harder, at a wider range of targets, deeper into Russian territory, for instance, than you otherwise, which itself is going to seem like is going to ask more of publics in the West, which then may make it less.
I see. I mean, I was just thinking of the initial Russian step in this scenario is highly escalatory. I mean, and so any NATO response to kick them out is not escalatory; it's responsive.
On how they shape, how they manipulate, and that's where the Little Green Men come in.
But can I just follow up on that? I think the key question here is whether there's a plausible set of circumstances that make the risk of the NATO response to these Russian actions make the action seem like a good idea. And I just can't see that, those set of circumstances coming together. I can see contingencies where we'd have to be worried about in that region, but they don't involve risking a potential significant U.S. or broader NATO response by deploying a sort of limited hybrid campaign.
So I mean, the example has been cited, I think, Bridget, you're going to this, was if you have a NATO response going into the Baltics or even potentially into the Black Sea theater. The Russians are developing essentially, I don't like the term A2AD, but that's what's understood. Whether it's long-range surface-to-air missiles, long-range land attack missiles, long-range anti-ship missiles in Crimea, in Kaliningrad. And so if you're going to do an intervention, especially when you're rolling back Russian forces that are already on the ground in these countries, you're going to have to deal with these forces that will be on Russian soil. Now, that is a political question for the alliance. My views and Bridget's views is that you will have to deal with this quite possibly with force. But that is not necessarily a universal view politically within the alliance. And that is, I think, one of the areas the Russians would exploit specifically.
Right. And can I just start briefly? But I think, at another kind of meta disagreement is, Sam knows Russian thinking a lot better than I do. But there are a lot of people, including a lot of U.S. government and NATO leaders, who think that the Russians are interested in seeing what they can get away with, and that degree of ambition and aspiration and risk running is a variable. And then we know that they're willing to use force, at least for some things. And I look at the situation, I say it's not irrational for the Russians to think, if they wanted it, that they could pull something off here. And I think there are reasons why the U.S. and NATO and Russia may get to that point, and why the Russians seem fundamentally aggrieved. Doesn't mean that we should ignore their complaints, but I do think that weakness breeds a kind of instability here.
I have follow-up questions, but let's go back to the audience here. Now we have several in the right. So first of all, the gentleman in the fourth row, and then in the third row, and then in the second row.
Alexander Alden, Avison Group. Thank you very much for a great presentation. And to follow up a little bit on these issues of trying to devise Russian intent, it seems to me that the discussion about this scenario is precisely the intent, namely that by focusing our strategic insolvency and how to compensate for that, which is the scenario you two are examining, they're achieving one goal. One is to make NATO officials think about the strategic insolvency of having expanded a lot, and that certainly precludes the possibility to expand further. Perhaps not Montenegro is excluded in this case. Then the second aspect is clearly we're talking less and less about the Donbass, and certainly we're not talking about Crimea. So there seems to be a certain strategic and political poking at these insolvencies precisely to have this discussion and move away the attention. And I think that's not part of the discussion so far, and I'd like you to kind of drive to that point a little bit more.
Did you get the question?
I did,
okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Mark Katz from George Mason University. I think it was Elbridge who referred at least twice to Russian hybrid warfare capabilities, their ability to make use of Ukrainian communications to zero in on Ukrainian positions and to hit them, possibility of Russia disrupting Western GPS capabilities. I'm just wondering if you can address the Western capabilities of also launching hybrid warfare as well. Presumably that, in other words, that the only response to Russian hybrid advance into the Baltics or anywhere else isn't simply, either a nuclear escalation or conventional forces, but also a hybrid response disrupting their communications, this kind of thing as well. And also, it seems to me that if one was a Russian planner, that one would have to take this into account. And,
Are you talking about in Russia, or are you talking about hybrid response in the threatened?
Hybrid response in general. In other words, they have no idea.
Let's take the other one here in the second row.
Yes, my name is Dave Williams. I'm an independent consultant, professor in counterintelligence and national security strategy. My question is a bit more concise than some. Sam made the statement that Russian aggression, correct me if I'm wrong, against a NATO country would trigger a massive response, because that's what military leaders do. My question is, and it's actually directed over here on this side, is that what political leaders do, and those political leaders that are in place at present? Thank you.
Okay, why don't we
First, one quick comment on West Berlin. I mean, if you look back at the declassified documents about contingency planning, the assumption was that the Berlin Brigade was toast within hours of the beginning of a general war. I would just say that if we're really concerned about this kind of a contingency, there are ways to, achieve deterrence by denial that don't involve deploying high-end capabilities to the region, such as the ones I outlined. If you close the seams, you don't give the adversary an opportunity to exploit them. And I think that's where efforts along these lines should start if it is a contingency that we need to take seriously. And given that most contingencies need to be taken seriously, sure. But the fact that it makes strategic sense to us sitting here is not an indication that it either makes strategic sense to those sitting in Moscow, or that therefore it would be a likely or probable outcome that we could see in the years to come. And the broader issue that I have is, I guess, the context in which I could see this being likely is one in which there is no ambiguity. And that brings us to the sort of level at which I don't doubt the kind of NATO response and cohesion as a result of Russian actions, I should say.
Yeah.
So,
Bridge, please.
so to AT's question, I mean, that may be something of what they're thinking about. I mean, my general sense is that, in European security discussion, there was probably an insufficient regard for Russian kind of strategic weight for many years, and we need to take Russian strategic power seriously. And if that means being more judicious about the extension of our security guarantees, then that's what we should do. And we should take more seriously what it means to be an alliance. And if that means putting forces forward in the Baltics in ways that are risky, then we should do it. But I don't think we should compromise on, I don't think we should cede the principle on things like Donbass or even in Crimea. But I think there has been a tendency in Europe to think that we can just kind of think beyond strategic issues, and that's unwise. And I think in some ways that's probably, if not been the cause, then at least exacerbated some problems. In terms of hybrid warfare, I mean, I think the main thing, I fully agree with Sam, and I imagine John does too, is that we should have, adequate integration, more than adequate integration of the Russian populations. I'm not particularly familiar with the issue, but and we should have civil authorities to make sure that you can respond to hybrid warfare. I'm not generally in favor. My good friends and very sharp strategists Wes Mitchell and Jakob Griegel have called for a more forward-leaning, what they call preclusive defense, a different kind of conception of limited war, which is kind of bringing the fight into Russian territory. I would be disinclined to do that as other than to pursue a kind of a limited war and fundamentally status quo defensive objective. I mean, in a sense, I'm a status quoist on the alliance and on our position in Europe, and I think we should hope that our model, we take a good, strong position beyond that, but we are not seeking to, find new monsters and slay them. And that doesn't mean compromising our interests, but it does mean being cautious about how we do. And I think the issues that Sam raises about the stability and instability problems are very real. I think there's a bit, and John is really the best expert on this, but there is the military specifics do matter, and I think I disagree with him analytically on the adequacy of rotational forces and the adequacy, I think, of the kind of measures that I think he would support. I mean, I think the nature, scale, sophistication, size of the Russian threat is such that you cannot rely on essentially token rotational forces if you're serious about it. I do think there are things that you can do, and Jonathan and I tried to talk about this in our article about focusing on defensive capabilities, anti-tank, anti-personnel, anti-air, basically designed to slow, retard, delay, bloody, rather than strike forces. Like, for instance, one thing you could do is you would not have long-range or medium-range strike. I've gotten in discussions with friends where I'd say, I don't agree with putting anything more than a pretty short-range strike systems in the Baltics or Eastern Poland on a permanent basis. Now, you might bring them forward later, but that's the kind of thing, and we should talk to the Russians about that. So we should say, all right, here's the kind of things we're willing to talk about. Observers, mutual exchanges of tests, data exchanges. We will talk about not bringing certain systems in, and you can verify that. I think that should all be on the table. But what shouldn't be on the table is basically giving them an opening to come in and create a fait accompli, where then we're supposed to, go to the brink immediately to respond.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that a little bit. So in the post-Cold War European security architecture, the two principal forms of reassurance, not only within the alliance for the alliance members, but also between the alliance and Russia, were the CFE Treaty and the Vienna document CSBFs. What we've seen in the last 10 years is first the Russians abrogated, basically abrogating I think is the correct word, CFE in 2006, over the question of forces in Georgia and in Moldova. And then we're hearing anecdotally now from our leaders in in U.S. military leaders in Europe that they're not exactly hewing to the spirit or even the substance of the Vienna document CSBMs on visibility into exercises and mobilizations. So these institutions were created basically as an early warning mechanism of intention. And so long as both sides adhered to these mechanisms, then that was mutual reassurance. Well, the Russians, for their whatever reasons they chose to do so, which the ones I suspect I fundamentally disagree with, but they broke CFE, and they're not adhering to the Vienna document CSBMs, it sounds. I mean, that's a fundamental signal. And I think what Bridget and I are talking about the idea of dual tracking, the idea that you could go back to the table and try and reestablish some sort of CFE, or just reanimating the Vienna document CSBMs. I mean, if the Russians don't bite on that, that tells you something, and you have to listen to that signal.
And it helps NATO cohesion, too.
Exactly.
We had advertised this event as stopping at 3 p.m. I see there's interest to have a little bit more discussion. I think I will allow another round of questions, but give anybody leave at 3 o'clock as advertised. So I'll take one here, one there, and then one that came in via the internet.
Thank you very much. Peter Swack, NDU, former U.S. Defense Secretary.
So tell us what's really going on here.
I'd like to talk, your title is Nature of Russian Threat. I'd like you to talk a little bit about Russian use, nonlinear use of information operations to confront that threat potentially to the NATO and to the EU, which is an arena, of course, we're intensely uncomfortable with. But it is also, it's meant from our open source work, quite an IMW piece. Way their press is going, for example, around the time just before Crimea.
Make it short,
The
please.
History Channel in Russia started to talk about Sevastopol. And then around the time before they hit Odessa in a failed, if you will, effort, Odessa is a So I'd like to kind of hear and have you sort of weave in info ops into your discussion.
And there were 3 questions on this side. Yeah, okay.
Hi, Patrick Mulder from Estonia. Reserve soldier, former diplomat, current cyber policy analyst, member of one of these paramilitaries you've been mentioning, and so on. For us, of course, this threat is much more real than abstract, right? And so it's been a very interesting discussion, and I thank you for that. I'd like to side wholeheartedly with the right side from my view of this particular debate. I think it's much more prudent, especially from Estonia's view, to rather than hoping that we understand the open source evidence of strategic thought, to actually think very hard about what kind of military capabilities are needed. I'd also like to push back a little bit on Samuel's view that any of these scenarios would not take place in an ambiguous atmosphere, because I think ambiguity is exactly what is a core aspect of Russian strategic thought at the moment. If you think about what was going on in Ukraine, if you think about what's going on in Syria, even the shooting down of a jet is still, or was attempted to be portrayed as ambiguous. The Russian population themselves are constantly caught in a state of ambiguity, because you have RT, or other channels pushing 7 different versions of events, right? And so basically I'd like to wrap it up by saying that let's rather than hope for the fact that this won't happen, let's actually prepare for it, and let's do it effectively. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We got 2 more short questions. Who were they? The gentleman in the Christmas green blue tie.
Yes, my name is Tommy Glakis. I'm a former staffer on Capitol Hill. We've got 3 people who have written books dealing with Putin, and I think Putin is very
Speak
important.
a little bit closer to the
I think
microphone.
Putin is very important here. And I think Angela Stent wrote one book, Fiona Hill wrote another book, and Karen Dowisha. Factor in what you think the difference between, let's say, Medvedev earlier versus Putin now, and when the time comes that Putin goes. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. And the last question, was there one more question? No, okay, I think that's it. And then I know the question was sent in from somebody viewing the event on our webcast. The question is, what is Sweden's geostrategic role in deterring Russia? This might seem to be a little bit off topic, but Bridge, your article, Jonathan, your article did mention Scandinavia a couple times, so I think it's a worthwhile question to pose. And then take this opportunity too for any final thoughts before we let people go. And maybe we'll go Sam first, and then Jonathan, and then Bridge.
So on the question of the rotational deployments that NATO member states have engaged in since early 2014, I think it's being set up as a bit of a straw man here. The idea is not to counter the capabilities that Bridge and Jonathan talk about. It's about reinforcing the link between potential regional contingency and the sort of global strategic one, right? In other words, in order to conduct whatever operation Russia in this theoretical contingency is going to conduct, they're going to have to kill American soldiers to do it. And that, I think, really gets us back to the fundamental reason why, in the broader context, our NATO allies can be reassured, because extended deterrence has a long track record of being effective in this context. So it's the idea of rotational deployments, I don't think was ever framed as countering Russia's high-end capabilities, because it's sort of comical that anyone would do so. On this question of the history of CFE and how it went down, I know too much to get into this, and it's sort of far more boring than anyone would want to hear about at this time of day. Certainly don't downplay Russia's quote-unquote suspension, I think is the preferred U.S. legal term for what they did in December 2007. But the bottom line is that we don't know in the current context what potential kind of offer that Bridge suggested the U.S. engage in, how Russia would respond to it, and therefore certainly attempting it seems logical in this context. I don't want to address information operations in this context, because I think there is a fundamental difference between peacetime measures to influence populations in other states, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, things that we've been doing forever, and the kind of what happened in Ukraine and Crimea particularly. So I really think we should make a hard and fast distinction between things that we find unpleasant but aren't on the continuum that leads to artillery shelling, and those that are information operations in the context of a war. So I think to our Estonian audience member here, thank you for your comments. I would say that the lack of ambiguity that I'm talking about is not something that I would consider to be a good thing from if I were sitting in Tallinn, right? I'm talking about a potential full-blown invasion when I say lack of ambiguity. And the point I'm trying to make is that fundamentally, the ambiguity that we saw in the context of Ukraine was context-specific, and that risking the same kind of ambiguity in the context of the potential for the U.S. to respond militarily, which is the primary threat perception that Russian strategists are driven by, fundamentally changes Russian calculus. And it's not about hope. It's about trying to analytically play this out and see which way allies ultimately can be best secured.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Okay, so I'm going to tackle the information operations question and the Sweden question real quick. Okay, so from my perspective, the information operations variable in this is not just about polluting the minds of co-ethnic Russians in some of these countries, or even minority ethnic groups in some of these countries. It's also about clouding the perceptions of political leaders throughout the alliance and beyond, general international perceptions of what is going on. And I think the Russians use the term reflexive control. There was a great paper put out by CEPA recently. There's also one that was done, I think, by the Institute for the Study of War, talking about how they view this. And it's not just about the propaganda aspect. It's also about understanding what your target's leadership want. What is it that they're trying to avoid? What is it that they're seeking? And then feeding them information nuggets that drive them to what they already want. And what I think the Russians have seen in the West is that the United States, a lot of the Western European countries are very hesitant to engage more directly politically with the Russians. And so I think that is a key variable in terms of the path in a crisis scenario towards complicating what the form of Western intervention might be in a timely manner in order to effectively prevent the Russians from fait accompli. So that's my view on information operations. It's basically getting us to do the things that they think that we're already inclined to do. Now, on Sweden, I think Sweden and also Finland are critical to the Baltic. I'm going to hardly mispronounce the location, but Gotland Island, the Åland Islands. It's been known for hundreds of years that these command the lines of communication in the Baltic. So the Russians were to do some sort of limited operation against either of these two locations. And there's been some interesting literature written from authors in the region about these various scenarios. That is, even though not NATO members, that is horribly complicating the alliance's strategic objectives and alliance security. And so I think with the Swedes and the Finns looking more actively at how they might cooperate more closely with NATO or even potentially NATO membership, there's certainly going to be Russian pushback against that. We're seeing that right now. But quite frankly, I think that the alliance can't neglect in thinking about what some Russian aggression against these two countries could mean in terms of alliance security.
Thank you, Jonathan. Bridge, you have the last word on the panel.
Okay. On Vladimir Putin, others know a lot more about it than I. I would just say that my impression is that Putin is a representative of the Russian elite, and so I don't anticipate substantial change unless there's a pretty dramatic transformation in the Russian political system. So it seems I actually don't like, and we didn't use the word Putin to talk about the Russians because I think the personalization of it is misleading. Whether or not one, he may be a terrible guy, but this is I prefer to use the word the Kremlin. This seems to reflect a pretty deep-seated, and I don't think it's reasonable for us to hope in the near term for such a transformation. So it's better for us to gird our loins, as the Bible says. Look, I mean, what's the difference here? I mean, Sam and we have some differences on what the military implications are and so forth. But I think our vision is that what's stability? Well, what's a reasonable stability? We have extended the NATO alliance to these new member states, which have long-standing orientation towards Central and Western Europe. If NATO means anything, it means the defense of the member states against aggression or serious coercion. And it's linked to our extended deterrence and our fundamental national strategy around the world. As I said before, this is the one part of the world where we are in a situation of conventional inferiority, at least in the local or regional context, against not only a nuclear armed adversary, but a nuclear armed adversary with at least parity and potentially more at the nuclear level. We should not underestimate the military problem, which I think is often the major issue, not only here, but also in Europe. General Scales wrote in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago that U.S. forces in Europe lack some kinds of rudimentary air defense capabilities. The time scales to get systems into the region in the event of a contingency would be weeks. Sam seems very confident the Russians are not interested. Others are not so confident, and others whose judgments I also respect and who have studied the Russians in many different ways. I'm inclined to look less at what may be passing intent. I know the Russians are disgruntled. I know they're willing to use force. I know they're unhappy about NATO. And this is an opportunity for them to not even necessarily make territorial gains, but to embarrass and potentially weaken, split, or corrode the alliance. So to me, the best situation, and I love extended deterrence, or I love deterrence, and I love it if we can make extended deterrence work. I think it's worth remembering in the Cold War that especially once the Soviets achieved parity, we did always have a much more significant conventional deterrent, and it was always a conventional deterrent that was connected to a broader conception of how escalation would work. And I think we should do the exact same thing today with a different adversary, or potential adversary, I should say, but one where we have a plausible story of how we would fight and to even a limited degree prevail. And I think that serious defensive capabilities that are connected to a way that NATO could fight a larger campaign is the best way to do that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for making this my first event here at IISS successful one. This was not an intelligence squared debate, so we won't ask you to vote with your hands about which side, whether the right or left you supported, but we support them all. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah. Fun. That was fun. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, John.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rich.
Thanks.